Go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to another session of the Workshop on International Survey Methods. We're very excited this time to have Lauren Young and Hannah Barron to present with us some joint work. You can see the list of co-authors there on the slides. Lauren's on the faculty at UC Davis. Hannah is, I think I didn't verify actually with you just now, a PhD candidate at Brown. And you're doing a postdoc currently? Pre-doc.
Doing a pre-doc at UCSD.
Okay, yeah. And they both do lots of interesting work on public attitudes and behaviors in contexts of violence, which is part of what they're going to be talking to us about today. For those of you who haven't joined us in the past for the workshop, we'll have them give them a chance to present. We go about an hour here, so they'll have roughly half an hour to present what they're working on. And then we'll open it up for discussion. You can feel free to put questions in the chat or just use the raise hand feature and ask your question live once we get to the Q&A. So thanks, Lauren and Hannah, for joining us, and looking forward to it.
Thank you so much. And let me say before I get started, I see that Pablo Paras from Data OPM is also in this group. So Pablo, I hope that you will jump in and kind of lead us during the Q&A process. He's also a kind of core part of the project and part of our advisory board and a partner on the project too. So what we'll be talking about today, and we're gonna try to keep this to a half hour because we have some discussion questions that we're really excited to pick your brain about. But what we're going to be talking about today is something that I think a lot of people who work, in Latin America, Central America, Sub-Saharan Africa think about a lot, right? How can we kind of ethically do work in places where, people are living in conditions of, coercion or living with violence, right? And especially if violence is the topic of our research, ethics is kind of a first order concern. So the kind of overarching goal of this project is to try to bring some more evidence and transparency to decisions about research ethics as a kind of part of our methodological toolkit. We were joking with Luke and Noam that, this is a bit like a PhD dissertation where we want to solve everything, at the beginning. So I don't mean to raise your expectations too high, but we're trying to kind of start contributing some evidence there. Okay. So the overarching question in this project is, when is research ethical, right? This is the kind of macro question. And so, I want to give an example of something that, some of the people in this audience may have grappled with before, right? So this is just a kind of example of research that, when Hannah and I have done a kind of lit review type of project before is really common, or a systematic review. Right, so imagine there's a study where a researcher surveys, 2,400 Syrians recruited through an international NGO about their experiences in the conflict, right? So in the consent process, she tells people the study might make them upset, will cover conflict, but everything is confidential. They can refuse or stop anytime. And then she offers $5 for participation in the study. So I'm not going to open this up, but I just want to kind of, have you think for a second, is this ethical? What would you need to consider in order to decide whether this was ethical or not? And I think the kind of main point that Hannah and I want to leave you with is that whether or not this is ethical depends on kind of empirical estimates or empirical outcomes that we can't actually estimate, right? So it depends on things like, do participants actually feel free to decline to participate, right? Or do they feel like they're going to lose some benefits from this international NGO if they refuse to participate? Do participants regret participating, right? Those are really important kind of outcomes that we can actually estimate in order to, to know if we're adhering to the principle of informed consent, right? Are participants harmed by participating in this study? Again, whether, say, people are punished for participating because some armed actor thinks that they are, giving information to authorities through this research project, that's something that it's hard to measure, but we can actually try to measure that. Okay, do they experience any benefits? On the other hand, so the kind of purpose of this project is to try to, in some context, to try to shed some empirical light on these questions. This is, I think, review probably for most of the people on the call, but we're kind of adopting the principles from the Belmont report, that structure all of our IRB applications, right? That research is ethical, or research should adhere to a couple of guiding principles, right? So the Belmont report puts respect for persons, beneficence, justice as the kind of three leading principles, and following a big movement in the social sciences around transparency, replicability in the past 10 or 20 years. We put transparency as a kind of equally important principle that in our we would argue kind of is necessary to actually ensure or support adherence to these other three, right? And so, to kind of recap what I said on the second slide, right? Ethical judgments actually require evidence, right? So whether you're kind of making these judgments in advance when you're designing a project, or whether you're, as a, say, reviewer or journal editor, trying to decide whether a piece of research is ethical or an IRB, you're making assumptions, right? You have prior beliefs about all of these elements that go into adherence to these three principles, right? And so our kind of overarching, our hunch going into this project, or the motivation for this project, is that the current research ecosystem, and I should say this with a caveat because it has started to change. Journals like the IPSR are starting to require more of an evidence review when papers are submitted. But in general, the research ecosystem, whether it's IRBs, funders, implementing partners like survey firms, or the kind of publication process from editors and reviewers, it's not, I think, creating strong enough incentives for ethical research. And there's often not enough good evidence, especially from the context where, we may be working, context of organized crime or civil conflict, to make really good, before the fact judgments around ethics. Okay. So we'll back these up with some more evidence going forward. So, but one, kind of one piece of evidence that we've already put together to kind of back up these general claims is Hannah and I looked at the kind of six top political science journals, the kind of top 3 general interest journals, and then JPR, JCR, kind of conflict focused journals, places where you would think that people would be kind of taking a lot of care around ethics. And just on the transparency point, in those articles and the appendices that accompany the articles, just a minority of them even kind of mention ethics, right? Let alone give enough details about ethical practices to let it become evidence that others can build on, and to enable it to be kind of part of the, say, review process. I won't go through this, but we looked at things like whether people reported on whether any harms were observed, whether people reported on the kind of risk assessment that they did when they were designing their methodology, and even just in recent years, when there's been more attention on ethics, it's a pretty pretty small minority of most publications that even mention these things. Okay. So I hope I've depressed you at this point, and maybe annoyed you, because I think we are often doing more than we put in our publications, right, on research ethics. And so now we want to kind of make a pitch for what we can actually do about this, and give you some of our preliminary evidence. So this project that Hannah and I and a big group of co-authors, and then a even bigger group of kind of advisors and collaborators like Pablo are working on is a study on the effects of asking about violence. And so the way that we're trying to start chipping away at this problem is to start with what we see as a really common practice in research on violence, which is asking about violence in surveys. So we kind of see this as, in some ways, like a common denominator where there's a lot of different research. Hannah and I have done some qualitative research together. We've done some survey work, we've done some experiments, but a lot of studies that are taking place in contexts of violence with human subjects do have some kind of battery of survey questions asking about violence. So that's what we're trying to start with to contribute evidence on. And in the kind of first iteration of the project, we're focusing on direct research participants, especially the respondents to these surveys. But we also are working out ways to also look at the effects on interviewers, right? I think if you've run a survey that covers violence, right, you probably have some experience with the kind of secondary trauma that interviewers can face. So we'll talk more about those pieces, but today we're mostly going to be talking about respondents. Okay. So this is a multi-part project, and the first step of what we have done so far is a systematic review. The systematic review, we basically did a kind of sweep of different search engines for academic research across multiple disciplines. A lot of this is in clinical psychology. There's very little of it in political science or economics. And we were looking for studies of basically just, both observational and some experimental of how people react to being asked about violence. And the kind of takeaways that we took from the systematic review, where we found something like 25 articles that really met our criteria, mostly observational. But some of the core takeaways were that there's often negative affect, but it often doesn't translate into participation regret, right? Or in other words, people may have bad experiences during these surveys where they're being asked about violence, or some of these were open-ended interviews as well. But it doesn't seem to make them regret participating, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence in the published literature that regret and harm persists, more than just a kind of immediate short-term effect. However, as you might suspect, the vast majority of that research is from the US, right? Where you can see here, there are 24 studies from the US. Oh, sorry, I underestimated the number of studies we had there by a little bit. So 24 from the US, and then the others are mostly from kind of OECD, Anglophone countries, right? We can call these weird settings, right? And these are mostly on past individual and interpersonal violence, not the kind of organized crime or collective political violence that we tend to study. So generally, right? It's not obvious to us that this would generalize to the kind of situations that we're interested in, right? And so we've started collecting some original evidence, and I'm going to kind of quickly go through 4 studies that we've done so far, and then I'll hand it over to Hannah to talk about what we're planning on doing over the next year or two. And so in the first 3 studies that some of our collaborators did only in Nigeria, in 2 settings, one Kaduna, which is kind of a intergroup, interreligious violence setting, and the second Maiduguri, which is a city or a region affected by Boko Haram. So in these 3 Nigeria settings, we, in these first studies, kind of asked people a battery of questions about their experiences with violence. And then immediately after those questions, asked them some questions about anxiety, depression, and PTSD. And in these first 3 studies, we found scant evidence of immediate effects on anxiety, depression, and PTSD, right? So this kind of initial evidence, again, only from one context, only immediate outcomes, kind of made us think that maybe there are not at least extreme immediate effects, negative effects of asking about violence. Okay, so if anyone is interested in this working paper, I think we'd be happy to share that. But you can see here on this coefficient plot, right, in the overall effects, in this meta-analysis across the 3 sites, there's no significant effects, and if anything, the coefficients, are in the negative direction, right? with some evidence of effects maybe even being like a little bit positive for men, and very clearly neutral for women. Okay. However, as we started collecting our own evidence, I'm going to tell you a bit more about how we did that. But you'll see the kind of takeaway is that from the first kind of original study that we did with more long-term outcomes, and I think where we improved the measurement a little bit more, where we improved the measurement a little bit, we're finding more evidence of negative immediate effects that do seem to dissipate over time. So let me tell you about, I'm going to talk about this study in a little bit more depth before I hand over to Hannah. So in this fourth Nigeria study, so in the same context, this was also in Kaduna, kind of a setting of interreligious violence that's been going on for at least 20 years, with kind of peaks and troughs in different periods. We basically set out to do this study in a way that would allow us to look at not just immediately after the survey, but also a couple weeks afterwards. So we're measuring for 2,500 respondents, their immediate reactions, and then we got about a 70% response rate at follow-up, anywhere between 3 and something like 6 weeks later. And here, just to give you a sample of what the treatment questions look like, the treatment in this experiment, right? We randomized whether people got these questions or whether they didn't. And the treatment is 10 questions that generally ask about people's exposure to violence at any point in their life, right? So we kind of base these questions loosely off of the Harvard Trauma Questionnaire, but then, really adapted them to the context, right? So these are just a few of kind of example questions, but they're kind of yes/no questions, things like, were you ever physically hurt, like being beaten or injured during a riot or other violence between Christians and Muslims, right? And this sample, these were carried out over the phone. This is a sample that was collected by a team of mostly psychology researchers in partnership with UN University. And they've been working for some years in Kaduna. So this is kind of, in a way that I think a lot of academic research is, kind of a partnership between an international organization, a survey firm, and a team of researchers. Okay. Any questions about this so far before I show you the kind of results? No. Okay. So yeah, Lauren, I see that you put a question into the chat, and yeah, thank you for that. So are observed harm that comes to participants as a result of participation in the research? So yeah, that's exactly what we're interested in thinking about. And we're even taking this more narrowly than that. It's what's the kind of observed harm or measurable harm that we can capture just as a result of being asked about violence, right? So the control group is getting a set of other questions that in this case didn't ask about personal experience with violence, but did kind of touch on relationships between Christians and Muslims in this area. And I think Hannah can talk more about what that might look like in the other sites. Okay. So I'm going to again show you a kind of coefficient plot. And here, I just want to kind of explain, we have these 9 different families of outcomes, right? So the first thing that we measured is emotional distress, just how anxious, how upset are people feeling at the moment of the kind of follow-up question. So either immediate or 1 month after. You can see down here, immediate's in red, 1 month is in blue. Then we have some questions. So these are all indices that are standardized. We have some questions asking about whether they felt like participating in the study in the survey was a negative experience or was okay. Then we have some questions about fear of retribution, whether they're afraid that someone might punish them for having participated in the study. And then we have some questions about positive experiences. So, did you personally feel like it was, helpful to you to kind of talk to someone about what had happened to you? Or on the flip side, positive for others. These are questions about whether you kind of think that participating in the study might have some positive effect on your community or kind of generally on people in situations of violence. And then finally, well, I guess second to last, we have kind of questions similar to what I showed you from the Kaduna and Maiduguri, the first studies, where we measured PTSD symptoms using a short battery of questions that have been used in a lot of kind of developing country contexts, including in Africa, in some parts of Africa, and then questions measuring depression symptoms. So these are kind of standard validated, although slightly adapted and contextualized batteries. And finally, we have some questions around whether people actually believed the kind of elements of consent. Did they believe that they could stop anytime? Did they believe that they wouldn't be punished if they refused to participate? And questions around regret. So, taking everything together, right? The positives, the benefits, did people regret participating? And so what we see here, when we compare the random 1,200 or so people who were asked the standard questions plus this battery of questions about their personal experience with violence, we see, I think somewhat unsurprisingly, that there is immediate emotional distress, right? So this is a 0.4 standardized increase in, how kind of anxious and upset people say that they are just at the end of the survey. Okay. That dissipates, by the kind of 3 to 6 week follow-up. They're no longer more anxious or upset than others. We also see negative significant effects on kind of how negatively they saw participating in the study to be. Again, that kind of dissipates. And something I think I forgot to say on the previous slide is that there's no differential attrition. So if anything, people who were asked about violence were 1 percentage point more likely to actually participate in the follow-up. So, it's always hard to tell if there's some kind of selection effect driving this, but at least in terms of differential attrition, it doesn't seem like the dissipation is very likely to be driven by the most upset people dropping out. Although I think we have more analysis to do on that we could do. There's also an immediate smaller, this is a kind of 0.08 standardized coefficient. So that would be like a small increase in fear of retribution that again dissipates. And then these are not significant, but here they're less likely to think that they kind of get something positive out of the study. Significantly less likely to think that the study will be positive for others. And here we don't really have significant effects, but in terms of PTSD symptoms, there's an almost significant small increase in PTSD symptoms when we ask, right now, are you experiencing this symptom of PTSD, like intrusion of negative thoughts? Nothing on depression, which we only measured at the follow-up and not immediately. And then on consent beliefs and regret, things are, the coefficients are kind of in the negative direction, but are not significant. Okay. So I see a question from Kate of what was the incentive structure for the study. Hannah, can you, I can't remember the amount, but people who participated in the study did get some airtime. Yeah, Kate, feel free to follow up if that doesn't answer your question. I think it was an amount that the researchers, our collaborator, Rebecca, who kind of designed this and embedded this study in an ongoing project that she was doing, it was an amount that she had set through kind of her past work in Nigeria. Yeah. Okay. So, the kind of overall takeaway of this is that, again, surveys with violence questions are clearly more distressing and are seen more negatively, right? They're seen as less positive for others, but these effects do seem to dissipate, right? So, I would say at the moment, and I'm going to hand over to Hannah here. At the moment we're kind of in this in a spot where we're trying to figure out, why are we getting such different effects in this study than we seemed to, or than our collaborators seemed to in their earlier studies, right? Is it something about the context, that may be changing? Is it the question wording that makes a big difference? We kind of tried to improve the question wording on all of these. or is it something about kind of measuring outcomes at the end versus the middle? And so I think, yeah, now I'm going to hand it over to Hannah for the kind of hard part of telling you where we're planning on going from here.
Great, thanks so much, Lauren. So Lauren just demonstrated that based on the systematic review that we've done of existing articles that ask participants to report on, their reactions to research, most of that evidence is from the United States and Europe and Australia. We have this sort of mixed results from different contexts within Nigeria, and we're now planning to go to a new two new study sites this year, in the next 6 to 12 months in Mexico, where I've done most of my field research, and also in Colombia. And we're hoping to sort of replicate with adjustments depending on the types of violence in the different types of violence that occur in these two places, a similar experiment. So we have 10 questions or so that ask about contextually relevant violence. So in Mexico, organized criminal violence predominantly, and also an ordinary crime, and Colombia, a lot more different types of violence related to, the ongoing civil conflict, and also different types of violence related to narco trafficking. So we have sort of a similar structure, and our placebo questions that we're thinking about are sort of other types of questions that social scientists might ask that are not related to violence. So, on climate change or on different welfare systems, so that we can kind of compare what the effects of asking about violence specifically are to other types of questions that researchers would be asking in that context. And in addition to this multi-site experiment, we're really eager to learn more about the experiences of enumerators themselves. As many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, enumerators have just a much higher intensity of exposure to these questions on violence, because, while they ask a respondent to reflect in, 15 to 20 minutes about their experiences with violence, they're asking these questions repeatedly over the course of multiple weeks, doing so in potentially risky contexts, and are often from similar populations that have been exposed to violence that the individuals that they're interviewing are also from. So we're really curious to also just do more descriptive work on the experiences of enumerators in Colombia and Mexico as well. So just to take an example of how we're thinking about the Colombian case, which we think might be the next case that we explore, and something that we're really eager to get your feedback on in our discussion in just a few minutes, is that we're thinking that Colombia is a particularly relevant and interesting case because of the wide range of political violence, unfortunately, that has happened there over the past several decades and is ongoing. So we think that there might be some really interesting subnational variation that we can explore there with respect to the types of questions, the types of violence questions, and the types of sort of the level and timing of conflict that individuals have been exposed to try to understand, are people who are asked about violence in a place with ongoing threats from organized criminal groups, is that more distressing than, asking someone about violence who is in a locality or in a city where, violence may have been really prevalent 5 years ago, but they feel more like the situation is more secure now. So we're curious in potentially exploring those differences among individuals and with respect to sort of timing and exposure. So these are just sort of 4 preliminary municipalities that we've been thinking about with variation along those dimensions: Tumaco, Tierra Alta, Barranquilla, sort of along sort of Pacific coast, more or less, and also Bogota, so the capital, which is sort of a very different context as well. So yeah, that's kind of the preliminary plan right now for Colombia. And just to sort of recap what Lauren already demonstrated in our Nigerian study in Kaduna, we, pick site-specific types of violence. And this is all adapted from sort of the Harvard Trauma Questionnaire that has been validated and used in many, many different contexts, has been translated, and it includes sort of a general structure of violence or trauma experienced by the individual themselves, violence or trauma experienced by loved ones, and then violence that's just been witnessed. And then the outcomes, again, to repeat, will be the same so that we can compare across sites, including sort of psychological distress, and also, very importantly, fear of retribution. So do individuals who participate in a study where they're asked about violence, do they fear retribution from groups, or under what conditions might they fear retribution, is really the question, and something that is very concerning. And other benefits, right? So individuals feeling like they have learned from participation, and then, Lauren went over regret. So, regretting participating in the study. So in addition to the multi-site experiment, or even within the multi-site experiment, we're hoping to field test a handbook of best practices. So we're trying to sort of develop for ourselves and gather as much information as we can from other researchers, implementing partners, the survey firms we work with. So definitely Pablo will be informing this field handbook significantly. That includes things, the nitty-gritty of how we do our risk assessments, and how we prepare for threats in the field, how we minimize risks to enumerators and respondents. So more specifically, what types of training and what goes into the training of enumerators, how do we incorporate trauma specialists so that they know how to respond to respondents disclosing distress or other types of trauma that they've experienced in culturally appropriate ways, minimizing risks to respondents. How do we think about referral pathways for different types of services related to violence prevention or response, or even other types of basic services that people might end up talking about needing a lot during the interviews. So thinking about sort of the referral pathways that we should have in mind before we begin fieldwork. So I want to make sure that we leave enough time for Q&A. And so Lauren, I'm wondering if we should just jump right into our discussion questions and sort of skip our emphasis again on how we think how we think transparency is important. So great. Okay, so we would really love to hear from all of you about sort of the most relevant and frequent measurements of violence. So one thing that has come up in some of our presentations is, we want to ask people to talk about the violence they've experienced. Some of that may be from organized criminal groups, but, asking people about their experience of violence or coercion from organized criminal groups is just way too risky or way too complicated in certain settings. And so we're really curious to hear from you all about, how are ways that you may have asked that, or have you thought about asking about violence in these tricky contexts. Also, some current practices with enumerator trainings for asking about violence. So how you incorporate specific types of trainings for interviewers so that they know how to cope with secondary trauma or potential secondary trauma, and also respond to participants themselves. And then other ideas about referral pathways for distressed or especially vulnerable participants. I think there's been some really excellent best practices from researchers who have worked on intimate partner violence, and they've done, and violence against women. That's sort of the most developed literature on referral pathways I've seen. But if anyone here has ideas about how to develop those or how to think about those, these are some really core concerns that I've been thinking about. And any other reactions, we would just love to hear from you. So thank you so much for the opportunity, Luke and Noam and everyone else.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing your research. It's really interesting and something we might kind of lose sight of at times when we're trying to get, research about violence out there. So yeah, I really appreciate your bringing this to us. So we can open it up for questions or comments. I saw there were a lot of questions in the chat. It seems like Lauren has answered most of them. But let's see.
I can come in with one. Yeah, I was just going to pick on that one too. Yeah, Jordan. So yes, I believe that the partnering organization was responsible for distributing the benefits, right? Which I understand to be the structure in kind of a lot of these surveys, or at least in those that I've done. Someone will participate in the kind of phone interview and then will be sent airtime or some kind of mobile money transfer shortly afterwards. On whether the respondents felt compelled to participate to continue getting benefits, so they weren't getting any kind of major benefits. It wasn't like a humanitarian organization distributing big services or aid packages. It's UN University, so they mostly just do research. But maybe people didn't understand that. It's possible that they would hear the UN and just think maybe I'm going to get something. So I think your question makes me think we should also kind of add a question about, do you think you'll lose any benefits? Because that's not actually something that we asked in this. When we asked people about whether they thought they'd be punished in general for participating or not participating in the research, it's something, I'm just looking at the plot, something like 85 or 90% said no. But on the other hand, something like 10% said yes. So so I think it's possible that there is something there, and that we should measure that more carefully in the next round. Yeah.
Okay, and Lauren Dam, hope I'm saying that correctly, had a follow-up on a previous question about different industries, or how the results can depend on the population that you're looking at.
Yeah, I just wasn't sure if you're collecting data on work, and if you are, that might help you figure out the risk profile and how you want to ask about things, or whether or not you want to target a subpopulation. I don't know if you're using like computer assisted, like what you're using. I mean, the other thing I was going to say was related to this current practices. One of the most interesting, so I've like overseen child labor and forced labor surveys in, I don't know, maybe 30 countries. And one of the most effective ways that I've seen of asking about violence for kids and youth was in a survey that we did on child labor in Peru, where we asked children about, and by children, I mean, these kids were 14 to 17. And there were some older kids, but in terms of children, we asked kids about violence that they've experienced in the workplace, including sexual violence. And for that section, we had the child take the tablet and fill it in themselves so that the enumerator didn't see it. And I watched kids when we were doing the piloting for this, I saw kids respond to things in ways I was very surprised by, in terms of what they were willing to share without becoming like visibly distressed by it. Obviously, it is a distressing thing. And I just also want to applaud you for doing this research, because it's something that we talk about all the time, how badly it's needed in this field. So I'm very interested in staying in touch on the outcomes.
Thanks so much. That's really helpful. And it's something that we've been thinking about with respect to sort of how privacy of response might moderate distress. And also, I mean, I think what your comment is making me think is that, maybe even to just make it possible to do the research. So those two things going together. So yeah, we'd love to stay in touch. It sounds like you have a ton of really interesting and relevant experience to share.
I see Noam and then Matthew Simonson have their hands up.
Well, thanks again, Lauren and Hannah, for sharing this. This is really, really great stuff. And I think, as Lauren already said, other Lauren, really important. So I'm glad to see this. I guess this is sort of a more of a comment or a sort of invitation than a question, but you know, you sort of start off with this motivation that what we know about this topic is sort of limited to a particular set of cases. And I guess I wanted to know what about those cases, like, can we theorize why you might expect different results in other contexts, and would that help you sort of address this question of why are you getting some results in some contexts than in others? I mean, I think, you know, even once you have the results from Mexico and Colombia, right, these things are so contextual, and you know, we're talking about very different types of violence and very different types of exposure and very different types of contexts in which people talk about violence or don't talk about violence, right? And so I wonder if sort of thinking about the specifics of the existing work might be sort of a way to help think about why you might expect to get, you know, distress in some cases versus not in others, right? It struck me, and you know, I've seen some of this literature in the US on sort of, you know, whether surveys re-traumatize victims and things like that. It's not, you know, I think there are lots of contexts in which we say these countries are weird and right and very different from other places, but a lot of those are, you know, psychologists talking about, you know, sort of childhood trauma and, you know, things that are really quite traumatic. So it's not as obvious to me that just because this is a wealthy context or, you know, sort of post-industrialized economy, that it obviously doesn't travel to other contexts. So I guess, yeah, I wanted to sort of invite you either now or, you know, more generally to sort of really sort of theorize why those contexts of violence, you know, we could expect to be different. And I think that would help sort of also, you know, people who want to sort of apply what we learn from, you know, this at the end of the study to be able to say, well, you know, given the context that I'm working in, you know, what kinds of things should I expect? Thanks again.
Just to respond quickly to that, it's such a great point, and it's something that has been on my to-do list for a really long time. I think, you know, we have been thinking a lot about, I think, yeah, this should be more explicit in the slide, but I think one thing that's really different is that in a lot of those US studies, the threat has been taken away, right? Like they're done with adults who are recalling childhood trauma, or you know, women who have left abusive relationships in many cases. And in most of these cases, the threat is still there. So that's something where, you know, we could dig into that more in the data that we do have from the US, but, you know, I suspect that that really matters. I think another study that's really influenced us is the Sierra Leone study that Andrilla Dubé and co-authors did, where they found that these kind of collective, you know, kind of, yeah, like discussion groups, like reconciliation sessions, something like 10 years after that war had ended, were kind of psychologically harmful to people. So kind of duration from the conflict, right? When some people may want to, you know, be moving on, that's another variable that we've been really thinking about. And then the third thing that we've just been thinking about is kind of just the basic way political scientists think about violence. Like, you know, there's civil war, there's organized crime, there's kind of religious extremism. So I think there we don't have strong priors about whether effects should differ, but it seems like we need to cover those to speak to kind of the broad swath of social scientists. So I like I noted down your point about cultural context. I think that's maybe something I don't feel comfortable talking about that. But just as a political scientist, you know, I feel like my training is more political economy, and, you know, psychology feels risky, right? So going into kind of culture and sociology, but I think you're right that we probably do need to kind of think about that more systematically. Yeah, so thank you for that.
Thank you guys for this really fascinating study, and I really can't wait for the handbook to come out. I want to build on Noam's point about timing and like how recent the event was. During my fieldwork and survey in Bosnia, For the most part, I found that a 25-year gap meant, and people having processed the war already through the extensive media coverage and the extensive, influx of researchers 20 years ago, meant that the survey was not bothering them too much at first. But then when Russia invaded Ukraine, all of a sudden this created a climate where people were seeing something similar on TV to what they had experienced back 25 years ago. And my refusal rates shot up, and I had to basically modify the survey midway through, because I consulted with a survey firm, and we're like, yeah, this is a problematic issue. So I wonder then, in the context of Colombia and Mexico, what next steps. Perhaps there's another factor to take into account, which is, even if violence in a given province or given state happened many years ago, if there's present day violence in the news in some other part of the country, that could suddenly sensitize people to the survey in a way they wouldn't otherwise have been sensitized. So I'd encourage you, in addition to looking at the timing of the respondent's own violence as a variable, to look at the present day news media or just word of mouth context as another variable that could make that past events more salient.
Thanks so much. That's a really, really interesting finding from your research in Bosnia. And these certainly are contexts where there's violence is really prevalent in the public imagination, even if you're living in a particular neighborhood where you're relatively safe and you can walk home at night without any fears, and etc. I think that's an excellent point, and something that we certainly should be thinking about more, in addition to Noam's comments.
Yeah. I see Kate.
Kate, yeah.
Sorry, Luke, I'm taking your
No.
taking your role.
Go for
ahead.
it. Go for it. Kate, are you there? Well, I guess, can I jump in the line and ask a clarifying question about the methodology of the Nigeria experiment results that you showed? So the standardized coefficient, is that the difference between people who were asked the treatment questions and the control questions? Or was it like people who said yes to the treatment questions and people who said no to the treatment questions? Or could you look at like subgroup analysis there? Like if you received the treatment questions, but you said, no, I haven't experienced any violence, then it seems like those should be taken out or treated differently. And then
oh, go ahead. Do you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to get back to the questions you asked us. I know we at LAPOP have a protocol for distressing situations. We don't ask about like ongoing violence, but we do ask about gang violence sometimes, or crime victimization. I'll have to research that, but I can get back to you with more information about what we do.
That would be fantastic. Yeah, I mean, one reason why we're presenting this, early is that we really want to kind of crowdsource this set of best practices, obviously with ample, citations and recognition. So yeah, that would be super helpful to know how you have developed that. And just to answer your question on, or your comment on, does the effect differ based on how much violence people have experienced? This is something that we've been kind of grappling with methodologically, because the treatment in those coefficients is being asked those questions about violence, whether or not you've experienced violence. And we don't know whether the people in the control group have experienced violence or not, right? And so to be able to kind of look at heterogeneous effects based on exposure, we need to know that for the control group. So we've gone back and forth about, do we do like a third wave where we, even ask the control group these questions about violence, but, then it's not exactly the same question because they've talked to us twice already. So, maybe they're going to answer in different ways. So we've also thought about kind of doing a predicted violence exposure. But I guess that's a long way of saying that I think I totally agree with your intuition that the effects should be stronger for people who have experienced more violence. And, in some ways we're kind of assuming that like everyone who gets asked those questions has at least some exposure to violence or some potential to be, distressed by these questions. But we've struggled a little bit to figure out exactly how to test that in a like really rigorous way. Yeah. And Kate, yeah, I see Kate, jump in whenever you want.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yay. Okay. I'm out walking my dog on my lunch break, listening to you guys. I was having trouble getting off mute. Okay. So I do research all over the world on very similar topics to this. And so one way that we have learned that increases the likelihood of honesty and disclosure is kind of two things. One is having an all-female enumeration team. Even if we're interviewing men, we find that in head-to-head studies that, rates of honesty and likelihood of disclosing, rape, incest, sexual, intimate partner violence all increases when it's a female enumerator that you're talking to. And then two, we have our enumerators armed with tablets, and we give our participants a short literacy test, and then we have them fill out the survey on their own. The enumerator is standing by in case there are technological questions, survey wording questions, but reducing that need to disclose to another human being and kind of relive that trauma like we're talking about. We've also found that to be really, really helpful in having more honest and accurate survey results. So I'm just curious if you guys have come across any of that in a more proven, tested way. We've certainly tested it internally, but if you thought about that and if that's something you might incorporate in future studies.
That's such a great question. So and it reminds me a bit of Lauren's point too. We have been, especially in light of these fourth Kaduna results, we have been trying to think of kind of mitigation efforts that we could layer on top of, this asking about violence treatment. And I think, the idea of giving someone more privacy is one of the things that we're most excited about. So yeah, we've been struggling a bit with, we have so few estimates of how harmful this is that we really want to be sure that we're getting good estimates of that. And so we're trying to be really conservative on power, but that's a bit of a like technical response to your question. But I think maybe like the summary of what I should respond to you is that we're thinking about that, and it's really helpful to hear that like two people kind of bring this idea up of additional privacy. And I think, yeah, we'll bring it back to the rest of our team and push again for trying to like build that in. We have a bit of a meta struggle where, we really want to do like a set of recommendations of best practices. And obviously we don't feel comfortable withholding best practices from people, right? So we can only kind of really generate experimental evidence for things where we have some equipoise, right? Where we're not totally sure that it's good or bad. And so I think we'll have to have more conversations about like, are we sure enough that giving people additional privacy is good, that we should just do it for everyone? Or do we feel like, it's worth actually generating some hard experimental evidence about whether that actually helps? So I don't know if you have a thought on that. Like, would you recommend that we just do it, or would you like put your vote towards we should test that experimentally? I'm sorry, I've
Sorry,
I didn't mean to ask a follow-up. Oh,
definitely
okay.
experiment.
Okay.
I definitely agree. Like when you're trying to do, codify best practices, like, again, this is anecdotal somewhat. We've done a, kind of testing here and there, but no, absolutely study the hell out of it.
That's really helpful. Thank you for your comment. Yeah.
Just one, I wasn't sure if it was a comment or a question from Megan Bramlett about subgroup analysis. Do you have any like results off the top of your head that you could share about subgroup analysis, or is that?
We honestly haven't looked at them yet. I know it feels like getting our data in November should give us ample time, but for my speed, we haven't. And thank you very much for giving some suggestions about what we should look at on employment and things like that.
Sounds good.
Um,
Hannah Rich.
Hi, thank you. This is I guess might be context specific, but as was just mentioned, right, the idea of a literacy test before you offer them this privacy. If you're looking for into how to do these things, I often get pushed back on offering anonymous surveys on people saying, but what about it? What do you do with the illiterate people? And so are there ways that we can sort of do these things? But then how do we offer privacy to people we can't just hand something to read to? So I know I'm throwing more work at you, but it's now the question I'm
No.
asking myself.
No, that's
Yeah.
a really excellent point. Yeah, and also in contexts where there's, you know, people whose first language is an indigenous language. I mean, there's a lot of other literacy and language questions for us to consider depending on our site selection in both Mexico and Colombia. Absolutely. So yeah, thank you for helping us think through that nitty gritty.
I think Hannah, one thing that you might reach out to Alex Scacco, who's at the WZ Bay. I know that she has been kind of testing a lot of these, kind of additional privacy protections in low literacy populations. And I believe that what she's developed is something like the enumerator will read questions, and then the person who has the tablet just has to push, kind of like a green or a red button, right? Depending on their answer. So I think, it's a little harder to code, but my sense from her work is that you can find a way around low literacy. Great. Yeah, thank you, Kate, for that point.
If I could just ask one thing real quick, among the treatment group, do people who have more negative reactions drop out before end line?
So what I've looked at so far is just differential attrition. And so, yeah, I think as I was presenting that slide, I thought, I really should just do this like a correlational test of whether people who had more negative reactions are more likely to drop out. I mean, you would think so, right? So I'll have to check that. That's a great suggestion.
Is there anything you want to say about the transparency with the last couple of minutes, or should we just save that for the book or article?
I think I would just love to say thank you, Hannah.
Likewise, yeah, I think we're just really grateful for the opportunity to learn from everybody here. And yeah, we'll likely continue to be in contact with you, Luke, about these topics and about how LAPOP is navigating them. So thank you so much.
Yeah, happy to continue the conversation. And thanks so much for joining us, Lauren and Hannah. Yeah, we'll wrap up there, and if you have any further questions, I think you can follow up with me, and I'll talk to the presenters. Otherwise, this presentation will be posted on our YouTube page, and I'll save the chat and send it to the presenters. But yeah, please join me in thanking the presenters once again. And we'll see you next time on February 13th, something like that.
Thank you so much, Luke. And yeah, thank you to everyone for your ideas. Yeah.
Thanks. Bye-bye.